For 38 years, my husband left the house every Tuesday morning and went to the bank alone. I never asked why. After he died, I found a safe deposit box I didn't know existed, dated from the first year of our marriage. Inside wasn't betrayal. It was something far more unsettling, something that made me realize love can be quiet, secretive, and devastatingly kind. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a loss that rewrote the story of your own marriage, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here matters more than you know. My husband, Thomas, went to the bank every Tuesday morning for 38 years, rain or shine, fever or flu, holidays, anniversaries, even the week our daughter was born. Tuesday morning belonged to the bank. He would wake early, shave carefully, knot his tie with a patience that bordered on reverence, and kiss me on the cheek as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Back soon," he'd say, every time. And I believed him every time. I never asked why. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it, how easily routine becomes invisible, how trust, when it's consistent, doesn't announce itself. It just settles into the walls of your life like a load-bearing beam. You don't notice it until something collapses. We were married young. I was 22, he was 25, and neither of us had much more than a rented apartment and a belief that love would figure out the rest. Thomas was steady in a way that made me feel safe. Not flashy, not overly expressive. He didn't make grand declarations or sweep me off my feet with gestures meant for an audience. He showed up. He fixed things. He remembered birthdays and paid bills on time. He held my hand when my mother died and didn't let go until I stopped shaking. So when he said he had a standing errand every Tuesday morning, I nodded and adjusted the coffee pot so it would finish brewing just as he came through the door. It never crossed my mind that a habit so old could be hiding anything new. Life passed the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. We raised 2 children. We moved houses twice. We argued about paint colors and vacation budgets and whose turn it was to take the car in for service. Thomas worked as an accountant, the kind who never cut corners and always came home with a crease still sharp in his trousers. I worked part-time at first, then full-time once the kids were older. We built a marriage out of shared calendars and unspoken understanding. And every Tuesday, he went to the bank. Sometimes he'd bring back a pastry. Sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd mention the weather or long line or a teller who'd finally retired. It was all so unremarkable that I never thought to be curious. Curiosity, after all, often implies suspicion, and I had none. When Thomas died, it was sudden in the way that makes your ears ring. One moment he was reaching for the salted dinner, the next he was slumped forward, his face gone slack, the world tilting on its axis. The doctors said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. Those words are meant to be comforting. They were, in a way, but they also left me stranded in the aftermath with no time to prepare my heart. Grief rearranges your days. It turns simple tasks into obstacles and complex tasks into impossibilities. In the weeks after the funeral, I moved through the house like a guest who didn't know where anything was kept. Thomas's shoes still lined up by the door, his jacket still hung on the hook. Every Tuesday morning I woke before dawn, my body expecting the familiar rhythm, and then remembered there would be no knotting of a tie, no soft kiss on my cheek. The practical matters came later, once the casseroles stopped arriving and the phone calls slowed. I made lists, I gathered documents, I learned which accounts were joint and which were not. I told myself this was just another phase of being married to Thomas, handling things together, even if he wasn't physically there. The bank was unavoidable. Accounts had to be closed, signatures verified, names changed. I chose a Tuesday morning without thinking about it. Old habits have a way of choosing for you. The building looked the same as it always had. Red brick, glass doors, a faint smell of paper and polish. I'd been inside countless times over the years, usually with Thomas, sometimes on my own. There was nothing about that day that suggested it would alter the way I understood my entire life. The banker who helped me was polite, efficient, and kind in the practiced way of someone who deals with loss as a profession. She offered condolences. She slid forms across the desk. She asked for identification and nodded as I handed it over with hands that still trembled more than I liked to admit. We worked through the accounts methodically, checking, savings, retirement. Everything was as I expected. Orderly, transparent. Thomas had always been that way. When we were nearly finished, the banker paused, glanced at her screen, and frowned slightly. "There's one more item under your husband's name, a safe deposit box," she said. I remember the exact way my stomach tightened, not sharply, not with fear, just a small, confused clench. "A safe deposit box," I repeated. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It's been active for quite some time." "How long?" The question came out before I could stop it. She clicked again. "Since 1986. We were married in 1986. The room felt suddenly too bright, too quiet. I laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound that didn't belong to humor. "That can't be right," I said. "My husband didn't keep secrets." The banker didn't react. She'd heard that sentence before, I realized. "Would you like to see it?" she asked gently. I told myself it was probably something practical, deeds, old stock certificates, something Thomas had tucked away and forgotten to mention, the way people do with attics and spare keys. Love makes room for small omissions. That's what I believed then. We walked down a narrow hallway to a heavy door that opened with a sound like finality. The banker retrieved a small metal box and set it on the counter between us. She slid it towards me and stepped back, giving me space. My hands hovered over the lid. I remember thinking very clearly that this box was the reason for every Tuesday morning I'd ever waved goodbye without a second thought. 38 years of routine, contained in something no larger than a shoebox. I opened it slowly. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, envelopes labeled in Thomas's precise handwriting, a ledger book worn at the corners, and on top a single letter with my name written across the front. I didn't read it right away. I couldn't. I closed the box and told the banker I needed a moment. She nodded and left me alone with the weight of something I wasn't yet ready to understand. In that quiet, standing there in the bank where my husband had gone every Tuesday for nearly 40 decades, I realized something that made my chest ache. Whatever was in that box, Thomas had carried it alone, week after week, year after year, and he had done so while sleeping beside me every night. That was the moment I froze, not because I feared betrayal, but because I sensed devotion I didn't yet have the language to name. I carried the safe deposit box out of the bank like it was something fragile, something that might break if I held it too tightly or dropped if I loosened my grip. The metal felt cold against my palms, heavier than its size suggested. I kept glancing at it as I walked to the car, half expecting it to vibrate with urgency, to demand that I open it right there in the parking lot. But I didn't. I placed it gently on the passenger seat, buckled it in without thinking, and drove home in a daze that made the familiar streets look slightly wrong, like I was seeing them through someone else's eyes. The house was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. I set the box on the kitchen table where Thomas used to spread out paperwork on Sunday afternoons, the same table where we balanced checkbooks and helped the kids with math homework and argued about whether we really needed a new dishwasher. I made myself a cup of tea, though my hands shook enough that I spilled some on the counter. I wiped it up automatically, the way you do when your body remembers how to function even if your mind doesn't. The letter sat on top of everything else in the box. My name, written in that careful block script he used for important things, stared back at me. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. Permission, perhaps, or courage, or the sense that opening it would somehow be an act of betrayal in itself. For 38 years, Thomas had carried this alone. Who was I to suddenly intrude? But grief changes the rules. It gives you a strange kind of authority. He was gone. Whatever this was, it had been left for me. I opened the envelope. "Margaret," the letter began, formal in the way Thomas became when he was trying very hard to say something important. Seeing my name in his handwriting made my chest tighten painfully. I could almost hear his voice, steady and calm, the way it always was when he was explaining something difficult. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain myself. I hope you will forgive me for that. I never wanted this to be a conversation you had to have with an empty room." I stopped there, pressing the paper flat against the table as if it might run away from me. My eyes burned, but no tears came yet. It felt like standing on the edge of a memory, knowing that once you stepped forward, you couldn't go back. He wrote about the early days of our marriage, about how young we were and how determined he was to be worthy of the life we were building. He reminded me of things I had almost forgotten: the tiny apartment with the leaky faucet, the secondhand couch that sagged in the middle, the way we used to count change on the bedspread and laughed because it was easier than panicking. I smiled at that part despite myself. It was comforting to know he remembered those days the same way I did. Then the letter shifted. "Before we were married," he wrote, "I made a decision that I have carried with me every day since. It was not a mistake, but it was a burden, and I did not know how to share it with you without changing the way you looked at me." My heart began to pound hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. This was the point of no return, the line between the life I thought I knew and the one that had been quietly unfolding beside it. He explained that during his final year of college, before we met, his younger brother, Daniel, got into serious trouble: gambling debts, the kind that don't stay neatly on paper, the kind that follow you home. Thomas wrote about late-night phone calls, about fear he didn't yet have words for, about realizing that Daniel's mistakes could ripple outward and harm people who had nothing to do with them. Their parents were already struggling financially and emotionally. Thomas was the steady one, the responsible one, the fixer. He took out loans in his own name to cover Daniel's debts, believing, hoping that this would be the end of it. It wasn't. Daniel disappeared a year later, left no forwarding address, no explanation, just a note that said he was sorry and that he couldn't come back. The debts, however, remained. Interest piled up. Threats followed. Thomas wrote that by the time he met me, he was already paying off something that felt like endless, something that belonged to a life he wanted to leave behind, but couldn't. "I didn't tell you when we married because I was afraid," he admitted. "Not of you, but of what it would mean to start our life already in debt to the past. I wanted our marriage to be clean, honest. I convinced myself that this was my responsibility alone. The safe deposit box, he explained, was where he kept records of every payment, every renegotiated loan, every dollar he set aside so that nothing would ever touch our shared accounts. Every Tuesday morning, he went to the bank to make payments, review statements, and ensure that the past stayed exactly where it belonged, separate from us. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter, staring at the wall above the sink. My tea had gone cold. The house felt like it was holding its breath with me. This was not the secret I had braced myself for. There was no betrayal, no hidden family, no second life built on lies. And yet, my hands shook harder than they would have if there had been. Because this secret wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about protection. I went back to the box and opened the ledger book. Page after page, neatly dated, amounts written with meticulous care. Decades of Tuesdays, documented in ink. I traced my finger down the columns, realizing that while I had been budgeting for vacations and school supplies, Thomas had been quietly budgeting for absolution, for closure, for a brother who might never come back. The other envelopes contained copies of loan agreements, correspondence with creditors, and eventually something else entirely. Statements showing a gradual shift from debt repayment to savings. Once the loans were finally paid off, Thomas hadn't stopped going to the bank. He had redirected the habit, funneling the same weekly amount into an account labeled simply for M. My knees buckled, and I had to sit down. For me, the realization landed slowly, like snow piling up until the weight becomes undeniable. All those Tuesdays after the debt was gone, he could have stopped. He could have reclaimed that time, that money, that energy. Instead, he kept going. He kept the routine alive, not because he had to, but because it had become a promise to himself, one he never spoke out loud. I thought about the vacations I had worried were too expensive, the times he gently suggested we wait another year, the way he never complained about overtime or skipped lunches, the way he insisted on paying for the kids' textbooks even when they offered to take out loans. None of it felt restrictive at the time. It felt like prudence, responsibility, love expressed in his quiet language. I cried then, deep, shuddering sobs that left me gasping, my forehead pressed against the table where his handwriting still stared back at me. Grief twisted itself into something sharper, more complicated. I mourned not just the man I had lost, but the version of him I had never fully known, the one who carried fear and obligation and hope all at once, without ever asking to be seen for it. As the afternoon light shifted across the kitchen floor, I understood that this discovery wasn't meant to shock me. It was meant to finish a conversation we had been having our entire marriage, without either of us realizing it. A conversation about trust, about silence, about the things we do for the people we love when we think no one is watching. And I wasn't sure yet whether knowing all of this brought me closer to Thomas or made the distance between us feel wider than ever. That night, I slept with the letter folded beneath my pillow, as if keeping it close might bridge the distance between what I knew and what I was still trying to understand. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of Tuesdays, an endless line of them, each one identical, each one carrying a version of my husband I had never seen. When I woke before dawn, the house felt heavier, saturated with thoughts that refused to settle. Grief has a way of reopening itself when you least expect it. I had thought the worst of it had already passed, that the sharpest pain had been buried with Thomas. But this was a different kind of ache. This was the realization that even after decades of shared life, there are rooms in a marriage you may never enter unless someone leaves the door unlocked on their way out. I spent the morning going through the rest of the box more slowly, more deliberately. The documents told a story my husband never spoke aloud, but one he had lived faithfully. I saw the early years when payments were large and frequent, the handwriting slightly tighter, the margins filled with notes. I imagined him then, young, newly married, determined not to let his past contaminate our future. I wondered how often he sat across from me at dinner, nodding along to conversations about paint colors or grocery lists, while his mind quietly calculated interest rates and repayment schedules. What unsettled me most was how normal everything else had been. There were no signs, no nights where he came home smelling of stress or fear, no unexplained absences beyond those Tuesday mornings I had never questioned. He had compartmentalized so thoroughly that even I, who shared his bed and his life, never sensed the weight he was carrying. By mid-morning, I found myself standing in the hallway outside his old home office. I hadn't gone in there much since he died. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and paper. His desk was exactly as he left it, drawers neatly closed, files labeled with the same careful handwriting I now recognized as the keeper of unspeakable responsibility. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside were things I had already seen before, tax returns, instruction manuals, warranties, but now they felt different. I wasn't just looking for paperwork anymore. I was looking for echoes, evidence that this secret life had brushed up against the one I knew. I found it tucked behind an old file folder, a photograph of Thomas and Daniel as teenagers, arms slung around each other, grinning at the camera with the careless confidence of boys who believe the world will always forgive them. I sat on the floor with that photo in my hands, tracing Daniel's face. I had met him once, briefly, early in our marriage. He'd been charming, restless, gone before I could form a real impression. Thomas never spoke of him again, and I had assumed distance or disagreement. I hadn't realized it was absence, complete and unresolved. The anger surprised me when it arrived. Not a loud, explosive anger, but a quiet one that settled in my chest like a stone. Why hadn't he trusted me with this? Why had he decided on his own that I couldn't handle the truth? Marriage, I had always believed, was about facing burdens together. Hadn't I earned that right? I said those words out loud, standing alone in the office. I could have helped. My voice sounded thin, uncertain. I wasn't entirely sure it was true. Because alongside the anger was something else, recognition. I thought about the times I had leaned on Thomas without realizing it, the times I had brought my fears to him and left lighter, never wondering where he put his own. I had been so accustomed to his steadiness that I never considered it might be an act of will rather than a natural state. That afternoon, our daughter Emily came by to check on me. She had always been perceptive, more emotionally attuned than her brother, and she noticed immediately that something was different. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "Mom," she said gently, "you look like you've been carrying something heavy." I hesitated. The secret had already outlived Thomas. Did it need to live on through me? Part of me wanted to keep it exactly where he had kept it, contained, controlled, unseen. Another part of me was tired of holding weight alone. I told her, slowly, carefully, choosing words that honored Thomas without hiding the truth. I watched her face change as the story unfolded, confusion giving way to sadness, then to a kind of awe that caught me off guard. "He did all that by himself?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said, "every Tuesday." She shook her head, eyes bright. "That sounds like that." And just like that, the anger loosened its grip. Hearing Thomas described through the eyes of our child reframed everything. This wasn't secrecy born of mistrust. It was secrecy born of identity. Thomas had always been the one who handled things, who absorbed shock so others wouldn't have to. This was simply the largest version of that instinct. Emily reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't think he thought you couldn't handle it. I think he thought it was his job to make sure you never had to." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I reread the letter again, slower this time, noticing details I had missed before. At the end, Thomas had written something that hadn't fully registered through my initial shock. He wrote, "I hope when you learn all of this, you won't feel like you were shut out. I hope you'll see it as the truest expression of how I loved you. I didn't want our life to be built on fear or obligation. I wanted it to be built on choice. Every Tuesday, I chose us." The simplicity of that sentence undid me. In the days that followed, I began to see my memories differently. Tuesday mornings replayed themselves in my mind, now layered with meaning. His careful shaving, his precise tie, his calm departure. What I had once dismissed as habit now felt like ritual, not of secrecy, but of devotion. And yet, there was still one unanswered question pressing against my thoughts. Daniel, the brother who had vanished, leaving behind debts and silence. Thomas had carried that story alone, then now it belonged to me too. I found myself wondering whether the routine had truly ended with Thomas's death or whether some part of it was still unfinished. Because love, I was learning, doesn't always end cleanly. Sometimes it leaves threads behind, waiting for someone else to decide what to do with them. The question of Daniel lingered in my mind like an unfinished sentence. Thomas had paid off the debts, had protected our life from their reach, but he had never known what became of his brother. Or perhaps he had known and chosen not to say. Either possibility weighed on me differently now than it would have before. Grief has a way of sharpening curiosity, turning unanswered questions into quiet obsessions. I returned to the safe deposit box again a few days later, this time with intention. I wasn't looking for proof of wrongdoing or further secrets. I was looking for context, for something that would help me understand not just what Thomas had done, but who he had been while doing it. Near the bottom of the box, beneath the neatly stacked documents, I found a thin envelope I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't labeled. Inside were a handful of letters, each folded carefully, each postmarked from different cities over the years, all addressed to Thomas, all unopened. My breath caught as I realized what I was holding, letters from Daniel. The earliest one was dated just a few months after Daniel disappeared. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. He wrote about being sorry, about needing time, about not knowing how to come home. He mentioned the debts only briefly, thanking Thomas in a way that felt inadequate even on the page. There was no return address. The later letters grew less apologetic and more distant. Daniel wrote about jobs that didn't last, cities that didn't feel like home, a constant sense of starting over. In one letter, years later, he asked Thomas to stop sending money, said it wasn't helping, said it only reminded him of everything he'd lost. Thomas had never opened them. That realization struck me harder than anything else so far. He had kept the letters, preserved them carefully, but chosen not to read them. It was as if he had drawn a line for himself, one that said his role was not to reconnect, not to interfere, but simply to make things right in the only way he knew. I sat at the kitchen table with those unopened letters spread out in front of me, trying to imagine the restraint it must have taken. How many times had he stood in the bank vault, holding these envelopes, tempted to tear one open? How many Tuesdays had he placed them back in the box, choosing discipline over curiosity? For the first time since his death, I felt something like pride swell alongside the grief. Thomas had not been a man of dramatic gestures, but this was quiet integrity at its most demanding. I didn't open the letters either. It felt wrong, like crossing a boundary Thomas had drawn deliberately. Some things, I realized, are not meant to be inherited. Instead, I turned my attention to what came next. The savings account labeled 4M had matured quietly over the years, growing into something substantial, enough to change the shape of my future if I chose to let it. Thomas had planned for me not just to survive, but to live with options. That realization brought with it a sense of responsibility I hadn't anticipated. This money wasn't just a gift, it was the product of decades of restraint, of choices made in silence. What did I owe that kind of devotion? I thought about all the Tuesdays Thomas had sacrificed, the lunches he skipped, the vacations we postponed. He hadn't done it so I could sit on the money like a monument to his self-denial. He had done it so I could be free. Freedom, I was learning, can feel overwhelming when you're handed it unexpectedly. I decided to do something I hadn't done since before Thomas died. I went for a walk without a destination. No errands, no list, just movement. The neighborhood looked the same, but I felt altered within it. Every house seemed to carry its own quiet stories, routines invisible from the outside. As I walked, I thought about my own habits, the things I had done automatically for years without questioning why. The ways I had relied on Thomas's steadiness as a constant, never imagining a day when it wouldn't be there to lean on. His secret didn't diminish our marriage, it exposed how asymmetrical our understanding of it had been. That evening I called our son, Michael. He lived farther away and had taken Thomas's death hard in a different way, more privately, more stoically. I wasn't sure how he would receive the truth, but I knew I couldn't carry it alone anymore. Michael listened without interrupting, his silence heavy but attentive. When I finished, there was a long pause. Dad always liked having something to take care of, even when we were kids. Remember how he used to fix things that weren't really broken? I smiled through tears. I remember. I don't think he ever saw it as a secret. I think he saw it as his responsibility. He didn't want applause for it. That word, applause, stuck with me. Thomas had never wanted recognition. He had wanted resolution, closure, a life where the people he loved didn't have to look over their shoulders. After the call, I sat alone in the living room, the evening light stretching shadows across the floor. I realized that the story I had been telling myself since his death, that I had lost my anchor, was only partially true. Thomas had anchored me, yes, but he had also quietly taught me how to stand on my own, even if I hadn't noticed the lesson at the time. The next Tuesday morning I woke before dawn, out of habit. The house was silent. For a moment, the urge to wait for the sound of Thomas moving around in the bedroom was almost unbearable. Instead, I got dressed. I went to the bank. The building felt different now, not ominous, not heavy, but familiar in a new way. I spoke with the same banker, explained that I wanted to understand the accounts Thomas had maintained. She treated me with the same gentle professionalism, but there was a subtle shift in how I felt standing there. I was no longer an outsider to this ritual. As I signed papers and asked questions, I felt something settle inside me. This place, this routine, had been part of my marriage all along. I just hadn't known it. When I left the bank that day, I didn't feel like I was closing a chapter. I felt like I was stepping into one Thomas had prepared for me carefully, patiently, over the course of a lifetime. And for the first time since his death, the thought of the future didn't terrify me. The weeks after that first Tuesday visit to the bank settled into a rhythm I didn't expect. Not the old rhythm of waiting for Thomas to come home, but a quieter one, shaped by my own footsteps and decisions. I began to understand that grief doesn't simply empty your life, it rearranges it. It asks you to notice what remains and decide, consciously, what to do with it. I started sorting through Thomas's things more deliberately, not in a frantic purge, not with the goal of erasing him, but with the intention of learning. Each drawer, each shelf felt like a conversation we hadn't finished. His orderliness had always been something I took for granted. Now it felt like a map. In the back of the closet, behind winter coats we no longer needed in this climate, I found an old notebook. Not the ledger from the safe deposit box, but something more personal. The pages were filled sporadically, not daily entries, but moments captured when something weighed on him enough to need words. Most of it was mundane: notes about work, reminders to fix the fence, thoughts about the kids' future. But every so often, Daniel's name appeared. Not in anger, not with resentment, just observations, worries, questions left unanswered. One entry stopped me cold. It was dated more than 20 years into our marriage. "Sometimes I wonder if silence is still the right choice," he had written. "Margaret trusts me completely. I see it in the way she plans, the way she rests. I don't want to take that from her, but I also wonder if I'm protecting her or myself." I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest. This was the Thomas I had never met, the one who doubted himself quietly, who questioned his own righteousness. It was comforting and unsettling all at once. Comforting because it reminded me he was human, unsettling because it meant that the story was never as simple as sacrifice equals virtue. I realized then that I had been romanticizing his secrecy as much as I had once ignored it. The truth, as it often is, lived somewhere in between. Thomas had done what he believed was best with the tools he had. He had loved me deeply, and he had chosen a path that denied me the chance to share the weight. Acknowledging that didn't diminish him, it made him real. I began to talk to him out loud, something I'd resisted at first. In the kitchen while making dinner, in the living room before bed, I told him when I missed him. I told him when I was angry. I told him when I understood him a little better than the day before. It felt strange, but it also felt honest. If our marriage had been built on quiet endurance, then perhaps this was how it continued, through dialogue that didn't require answers. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found something unexpected: a small envelope taped to the inside of a drawer, labeled simply, "If needed." Inside was a list written in Thomas's hand: phone numbers, names, instructions. At the bottom, one line stood out: "If Daniel ever comes back, tell him I forgave him long ago." My breath caught. There was no bitterness in that sentence, no condition, just closure waiting patiently in case it was ever required. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what forgiveness had cost Thomas, not financially, not logistically, but emotionally. Forgiveness that never reaches its recipient has to live somewhere. Thomas had carried it quietly, the same way he carried everything else. That evening, I made a decision I hadn't known I was circling for weeks. I went back to the safe deposit box and retrieved the unopened letters. I didn't open them. I didn't feel the need to, but I copied the return addresses, such as they were, the partial clues Daniel had left behind. I wasn't looking to reopen old wounds. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I just felt that if Thomas had spent decades preparing for the possibility of Daniel's return, then perhaps my role was to honor that readiness. The search was slow and inconclusive at first. Some addresses led nowhere. Others led to businesses that no longer existed. But persistence, I was learning, was something I had inherited by proximity, if not by nature. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The sharpness of grief softened into something more manageable, though it never disappeared entirely. And then, one afternoon, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was hesitant, older, edged with caution. He introduced himself slowly, as if expecting to be cut off. It was Daniel. He had found me through a distant relative, after years of drifting, after decades of carrying his own version of silence. He didn't know Thomas was gone. When I told him, there was a long pause, followed by a sound that might have been a sob. "I should have come back," he said. "I was ashamed." I told him what Thomas had done. Not all of it, not the details that belonged to the vault and the Tuesdays, but enough for him to understand that his brother had never stopped believing in him, even from a distance. "He forgave you," I said, "a long time ago." Daniel's voice broke completely then. In that moment, I understood something essential. Thomas's secret hadn't just protected me, it had protected the possibility of redemption for someone who might one day need it. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time, letting the implications settle. This was the ripple effect of love expressed through restraint. It didn't end with Thomas, it moved outward, touching lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. The following Tuesday, I returned to the bank again, this time not out of habit or necessity, but intention. I closed the safe deposit box. As I handed over the key, I felt a surprising sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I finally understood what that small metal box had represented. It wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake, it was a boundary Thomas had built so that love could grow undisturbed on the other side. Walking out into the sunlight, I realized something that felt both simple and profound. My marriage hadn't been a story of ignorance followed by revelation. It had been a story of trust, imperfect, asymmetrical, but real. And now it was my turn to decide how to carry what had been entrusted to me. Closing the safe deposit box did not feel like an ending. If anything, it marked the moment when Thomas's long, quiet vigilance finally loosened its grip on my days. I no longer woke with the echo of Tuesdays pressing against my chest. Instead, I woke with a gentler awareness of choices waiting to be made, of time that now belonged to me in a way it never had before. Daniel and I spoke a few more times over the following weeks. Our conversations were cautious at first, each of us aware that we were connected by absence as much as by blood or marriage. He told me about the years after he disappeared, how he drifted from city to city, job to job, never staying long enough to put down roots. Shame, he said, had a way of keeping him moving. Every time he thought about reaching out to Thomas, he imagined disappointment on the other end of the line and chose silence instead. He never stopped helping you, I told him once, even when you told him not to. Daniel went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "That sounds like him," he said. "He always cleaned up my messes." I corrected him gently. He chose to help. There's a difference. Daniel came to visit a few months later. I hadn't known what to expect, only that Thomas would have wanted me to open the door if it ever happened. When Daniel stood on the porch, older and thinner than the boy in the photograph I'd found, I felt a strange blend of familiarity and distance. He looked like Thomas in small ways, the same brow, the same careful posture, but his eyes carried a restlessness Thomas had long since tamed. We sat at the kitchen table where I had read the letter for the first time. I made coffee. We spoke about Thomas, his habits, his dry humor, the way he insisted on fixing things himself, even when it would have been easier to ask for help. Daniel listened with an intensity that bordered on hunger, as if each detail filled in a missing piece of his own life. "I didn't deserve him," Daniel said finally. "No one deserves that kind of devotion," I replied. "That doesn't mean it wasn't real." Before he left, I gave Daniel the letters, still unopened. "These were for him," I said. "What you do with them now is up to you." He held them like something sacred, eyes shining. He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. Some things don't require acknowledgement to be complete. After Daniel left, I expected to feel drained. Instead, I felt lighter. The past had been acknowledged, not erased. Thomas's silence had finally found an answer, not through confrontation, but through understanding. As months turned into a year, I began to use the savings Thomas had built so carefully. Not extravagantly, not impulsively. I repaired the house where it needed attention, updated things we had postponed for years. I took a small trip with Emily, something Thomas had always encouraged but never prioritized for himself. Standing on a quiet beach, listening to my daughter laugh as she walked ahead of me, I felt Thomas's presence not as absence, but as foundation. People asked me how I was doing, and for the first time, I had an answer that felt true. I told them I was learning how to hold grief without letting it define every moment, learning how to appreciate love that wasn't loud or performative, but steadfast and enduring. I thought often about the moral of Thomas's life, not one he ever articulated, but one he lived with discipline. Love, he had shown me, is not always transparent. Sometimes it is protective, sometimes it is quiet, and sometimes it asks us to trust that the people we love are acting in good faith, even when we don't know the whole story. On what would have been our 40th anniversary, I went to the bank one last time, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but out of respect. I stood in the lobby for a moment, watching people come and go, each carrying their own routines, their own unspoken reasons. I realized how many stories pass through places like this unnoticed, how many acts of devotion are mistaken for simple errands. I walked out without conducting any business and felt a smile tug at my lips. Thomas's Tuesdays were complete. The ritual had served its purpose. That night, I sat alone in the living room, a photo album open on my lap. There we were, young, hopeful, unaware of the decades ahead. I touched his image softly and spoke aloud, my voice steady. I see you now, all of you. It wasn't forgiveness he needed, it was recognition. And in that moment, I felt certain that if he could hear me, he would be content with that. The secret that once froze me had transformed into something else entirely, a testament to the ways love can endure beyond explanation. My marriage had not been perfect, it had been human, and in its quiet, imperfect way, it had been extraordinary. I closed the album and turned off the light, carrying with me a truth that would guide me for the rest of my life. We never fully know the people we love, but sometimes, if we are lucky, we are loved more deeply than we ever realize. As time continued to move forward, I noticed something subtle but undeniable shifting inside me. The sharp edges of grief had softened, but in their place was a deeper awareness, one that followed me through ordinary moments, folding laundry, waiting at a red light, standing in line at the grocery store. I found myself thinking about how many lives are built on quiet sacrifices no one ever applauds, how many people wake up each day carrying responsibilities they never speak aloud. Thomas had been one of those people, and now that I truly understood that, I felt an unexpected responsibility of my own, not to replicate his silence, but to honor his intention. I began volunteering at a local financial literacy center, something I never would have imagined doing before. I wasn't an expert, not in the way Thomas had been, but I understood budgets, discipline, and long-term planning. More importantly, I understood fear. I understood what it meant to lie awake at night wondering how one decision could ripple outward and affect everyone you love. The people who came through those doors reminded me of Daniel in his early years, overwhelmed, ashamed, desperate not to let their mistakes define them. I never told Thomas's story outright. It wasn't mine to give away, but I carried its spirit into every conversation, every calm reassurance that problems could be faced without panic, that responsibility didn't have to mean isolation. Sometimes when I was driving home after a long day, I would realize it was Tuesday. The awareness no longer carried sadness. Instead, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a nod to a chapter that had shaped me. Emily noticed the change before I did. "You seem steadier," she said one afternoon when we were sorting through old holiday decorations. different, but in a good way. I thought about it for a moment. I think I finally stopped asking why, I said, and started asking what now. She smiled. Dad would like that. Michael, too, seemed lighter when we spoke. He told me once that knowing the full truth about his father had changed how he approached his own marriage. He said, I don't want to disappear into responsibility, but I don't want to avoid it either. There has to be a balance. I nodded, recognizing the same tension Thomas had written decades earlier. Love requires judgment, timing, courage. There is no universal formula, only choices we make with the information and emotional tools we have at the time. Daniel wrote me a letter several months after his visit. Not an email, a real letter, handwritten, folded carefully. He told me he had opened the envelopes at last, all of them. He said it had taken him days to work up the courage. Reading his own words from the past had been painful, but also grounding. He said it helped him forgive himself in a way he never had before. At the end, he wrote, I realized Tom didn't need me to be better for him to love me. He just needed to know I might be someday. I held that sentence with reverence. It explained so much, not just about the brothers, but about my marriage as well. Thomas had loved forward, investing in futures that weren't guaranteed. As another year passed, I began to sort through my own affairs, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I organized documents, updated records, wrote letters to my children, not confessions or apologies, but reminders of who I was, of what I valued, of how deeply they were loved. One afternoon, I sat at the same kitchen table and wrote something that surprised me, a letter to Thomas, not to ask questions, not to argue, but to tell him what I had learned since he left. I told him I finally understood the weight he carried, that I didn't agree with every choice, but I respected the intention behind them, that I wished he had trusted me more, but I forgave him for not knowing how, that his love, though quiet, had shaped me more profoundly than I ever realized. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in a small box of my own, not to hide it away, but to keep it, proof that love can evolve even after death. On a clear morning not long after, I returned to the cemetery. I stood beside his grave, the grass trimmed neatly, the stone cool beneath my fingers. I didn't cry. I didn't feel frozen. I felt present. I'm okay, I told him, and I see now that you always knew I would be. There was peace in that realization, not the kind that erases loss, but the kind that allows it to coexist with gratitude. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something that made me pause. An older couple was passing by, hand in hand. The man was explaining something earnestly, gesturing towards the distance. The woman listened, nodding, her grip firm but gentle. I wondered what routines they shared, what silent promises shaped their days. It struck me then that my story, our story, was not unique in structure, only in detail. Love, especially long-lasting love, is often built on things we never see, on Tuesdays we don't question, on choices we don't witness, on doors quietly closed so others can live without fear. And yet, here I was, on the other side of that door, changed but not broken. I drove home slowly, windows down, the future no longer a blur of uncertainty, but a landscape I felt equipped to navigate. Thomas's secret had not diminished our life together. It had expanded my understanding of it. I knew there was one final thing left to do, one last way to bring the story full circle. And as I turned onto my street, I felt ready. The final thing I needed to do did not announce itself with urgency. It arrived quietly, the way most truths do when you are finally ready to hear them. One morning, as I stood in the hallway holding a box of Thomas's old ties, ties he had worn every Tuesday with such care, I realized that closure was not about preserving the past or dissecting it further. It was about choosing how to carry it forward. I laid the ties out on the bed, smoothing them one by one. Each one held a memory: weddings, work dinners, funerals, ordinary Tuesdays. I kept a few, the ones that felt most like him, and donated the rest. Letting them go did not feel like losing him again. It felt like acknowledging that his purpose had been fulfilled. Later that day, I drove to the bank, not as a ritual, but as a destination with intent. I met with a financial advisor and finalized something Thomas had never written down, but had clearly prepared me for. I set up a modest fund in his name, dedicated to helping people quietly overwhelmed by debt and poor choices, people too ashamed to ask for help, but desperate for a second chance. I didn't call it a charity, I called it a bridge. No plaques, no announcements, just help offered discreetly, respectfully, with dignity and tact. When I signed the papers, my hand did not shake. I felt Thomas with me, not watching, not judging, just present in the steadiness of the moment. That evening, I told Emily and Michael what I had done. They listened, thoughtful and proud in equal measure. "That sounds exactly like Dad," Michael said. "No," I replied gently. "It sounds like us." Because that was the final realization, the one that brought everything into focus. Thomas's secret had never been solely his. It had shaped our marriage, our children, and now my future. I was not merely the recipient of his quiet love. I was its continuation. Weeks later, I received one more letter from Daniel. He told me he had started attending counseling, that he had found steady work, that he was trying for the first time to stay in one place long enough to build something. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I think Tom believed I could be better before I ever did. I'm trying to live up to that now." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my own box alongside the one I had written to Thomas. Two brothers connected by silence, now connected by healing. On a Tuesday morning not long after, I woke early out of habit and made myself a cup of coffee. The sun rose slowly, painting the kitchen in soft gold. I sat at the table where this journey had truly begun and allowed myself to simply be still. For the first time, there was no ache attached to the day, no phantom expectation of the front door opening, just gratitude. Gratitude for the years we had shared, gratitude for the love I had received without always recognizing it, gratitude even for the shock that had frozen me in that bank vault, because without it, I might never have seen the full measure of the man I married. I thought about all the Tuesdays ahead, mine now, unclaimed, unwritten. They no longer frightened me. They felt open. Before noon, I took a walk through the neighborhood, the same streets, the same houses, but I moved through them differently. I noticed small things I had overlooked for years, the way sunlight filtered through leaves, the sound of distant laughter, the quiet resilience of ordinary life continuing. At one corner, I paused and watched a woman struggling to carry groceries from her car. Without thinking, I crossed the street and helped her. She thanked me, surprised and relieved. It was a small thing, insignificant really, but as I walked away, I felt something settle comfortably in my chest. This, I realized, is how love survives. Not through grand revelations or dramatic confessions, but through everyday acts that ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. That evening, I placed Thomas's photograph on the mantel, not as a shrine, but as a companion to my ongoing life. I lit a candle, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. I spoke to him one last time, not out loud, but within myself. Your Tuesdays mattered, I thought, and so do mine. The freezing moment I once feared, the one where everything changed, had not destroyed my understanding of love. It had refined it. Love is not diminished by what is left unsaid if the intention is care, but it is deepened when truth, even delayed, is finally revealed with tenderness. I no longer wished I had known sooner. I knew now, and that was enough. As I turned off the light and prepared for bed, the house felt warm, inhabited by memory, but not imprisoned by it. I understood finally that my marriage had not ended with Thomas's death. It had transformed. It lived on in the choices I made, the compassion I extended, the steadiness I carried forward. For 38 years, my husband went to the bank every Tuesday, quietly shaping a future I would one day step into alone. When he died, I thought I had lost the foundation of my life. Instead, I discovered it had been reinforced all along, carefully, patiently, out of sight. And now, standing firmly on that foundation, I was ready to live the rest of my life not frozen by revelation, but warmed by understanding. That was his final gift to me, and I would honor it every day that followed.